G'day everyone, you're watching Kath with a K. I'm Kath, and I know, just like everyone else in this entire world, that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to master a skill. Or does it? Where did this saying come from? Is it true? I'm here to answer those questions, if Google allows me to. Well, this bodes very well. The first thing that comes up is new study destroys Malcolm Gladwell's famous 10,000 hour something. So it seems to be closely associated with pop psych writer Malcolm Gladwell. What is a pop psych writer? In Outliers. I've actually read that book. And I remember stuff about 10,000 hours being said in there, but I couldn't remember if that's where it actually came from or like where they actually came up with that number. But a new Princeton study tears that theory down. In a meta-analysis of 88 studies on deliberate practice, the researchers found that practice accounted for just a 12% difference in performance in various domains. It depends on the domain. That's interesting. I use that word way too much. In games, practice made for a 26% difference. In music, it was a 21% difference. That's my domain. In sports, an 18% difference. In education, a 4% difference. And in professions, just a 1% difference. The best explanation of the domain dependency is probably found in Franz Johansson's book, The Click Moment. So one book's not great, but this other book's great. Deliberate practice is only a predictor of success in fields that have super stable structures. For example, tennis, chess, classical music. The rules never change, so you can study up to become the best. But in less stable fields, rules can go out the window. Now let's go back to the Google search and see what else is in store for us. There's a Wikipedia page for the book Outliers. Throughout the publication, Gladwell repeatedly mentions the 10,000 hour rule, claiming that the key to achieving world-class expertise in any skill is, to a large extent, a matter of practicing the correct way for a total of around 10,000 hours. Though the authors of the original study this was based on have disputed Gladwell's usage. So it seems that he did get this from a study. I really should remember this, given that I've read this book. Although I must say that when I read this book, what I really took away from it was more that chance plays a really big role, because in the book they talk about how, for example, professional sports people, they tend to be born more in earlier times of the year, especially in January. And that was because when you're really young, which is when you start separating people based on sporting abilities to see who will rise up further and be more likely to get to a professional level versus who won't. Those small developmental differences based on age really make a big difference at that point, and that effect just gets compounded throughout your life. And it goes on to talk about how in other areas of life, small differences based on chance can have similar really large effects. But I definitely want to find out what exact study this is that the 10,000 hour rule came from, which is apparently the incorrect usage of the phrase. We've got a much more recent article here from Google. Blow to 10,000 hour rule as study finds practice doesn't always make perfect. This is from August 2019. Oh my god, I love this sentence. With blatant disregard for the public benefits of motivational idioms, researchers have concluded that practice does not necessarily make perfect. I love that for us. A study of violinists found that merely good players practice as much as better players, leaving other factors such as quality of tuition, learning skills, and perhaps natural talent to account for the difference. They say that the exact phrase 10,000 hours is the magic number of greatness is in this book Outliers. So I can see how people continue to use that to this day now. The idea has become really entrenched in our culture, but it's an oversimplification. The seed for the 10,000 hour rule was a 1993 study of violinists and pianists, which found that accumulated practice time rose with musical prowess. Oh, is this one of those things where correlation does not equal causation? My last science video was about that, so check that out if you'd like to see more about that concept. On average, top-ranked violinists had clocked up 10,000 hours of practice by the age of 20, though many had actually put in fewer hours. Now, if you're talking about an average, I feel like for something like this, for amount of time practiced over a lifetime on one instrument, there would be such a wide variation in that surely finding an average of that wouldn't even really tell you much. I wonder what the actual range was. I guess we'll find out in a moment. In the study, the authors rejected an important role for natural talent and argued that differences in ability, even among top musicians, were largely down to how much they practiced. Oh my god, are you serious? I have to purchase the PDF. Okay, I'm gonna have a look to see if this is the article that's quoted everywhere else before I actually buy it, because I don't want to end up having to buy like 5 articles. The 10,000 hour rule was debunked again. That's a relief. Is it? The journal Royal Society Open Science published a replication of an influential 1993 study on violin players at a music school in the journal Psychological Review. That appears to be referring to the same study as what I just found. In fact, the majority of the best violinists had accumulated less practice alone than the average amount of the good violinists. So I think this might support a different motivational idiom of work smarter, not harder. This isn't exactly a massive revelation. Also, it's always been a bit of a stretch to extrapolate findings from a study on violin students to other areas. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Perhaps the effect that practice has on one skill isn't the same as the effect it would have on other skills. Genetics, personality, life history, etc. make up the majority of the difference. So how much of a natural are you? How talented? How skilled were you on a violin when you came out of the womb? That is the difference in whether you're going to be an expert or not. If you were born within the last hour and someone hands you a violin and you can't play a concerto right then and there, you're not going to be an expert. Basically, that's what I'm getting from this. Let's just look at this last one. The 10,000 hour rule was wrong, according to the people who wrote the original study. Okay, what the original study actually found. It was a group of violin students in a music academy in Berlin. It stated that the most accomplished students had put in an average of 10,000 hours of practice by their 20th birthday. So that's already not over a lifetime, that's just before they're 20, which is very early. I think they here refers to the people who published the original study. They laid out some of its main points in an excerpt where they mentioned the fundamental flaws with the 10,000 hour rule. Problem 1, the number 10,000 was chosen arbitrarily. Gladwell could just as easily have mentioned the average amount of time the best violin students had practiced by the time they were 18. At 18 or 20, these students were nowhere near masters of the violin, but still had a long way to go at the time of the study. Pianists who win international piano competitions tend to do so when they're around 30 years old, and thus they've put in about 20,000 to 25,000 hours of practice by then. So 10,000 hours is only halfway down that path. Well, that's actually more daunting than the original saying. It is very important to differentiate between the amount of time required to become extremely good at something, to become a master at something, and to become the world's best at something. Okay, cool. So I think I have confirmation that the 1993 study that I found earlier is in fact the original study that the 10,000 hours came from. And here's the study that started it all. The role of deliberate practice in the acquisition of expert performance. So they begin with many characteristics once believed to reflect innate talent are actually the result of intense practice extended for a minimum of 10 years. This study looks at something they call deliberate practice. So first they define what deliberate practice is. They want to distinguish activities invented with the primary purpose of improving skills from other types of everyday activities where you might indirectly learn. A number of conditions for optimal learning and improvement of performance have been uncovered, and they cite some previous studies. The most cited condition concerns the subject's motivation to attend to the task and exert effort to improve their performance. The task should take into account pre-existing knowledge so the task can be correctly understood, and the subject should receive immediate informative feedback. So they say when these conditions are met, practice improves accuracy and speed of performance on cognitive, perceptual, and motor tasks. So a key thing that defines deliberate practice here is adequate feedback. In the absence of adequate feedback, efficient learning is impossible and there's only minimal improvement, even if you're highly motivated. So they cite a 1984 study by Bloom here, where students were randomly assigned to instruction by a tutor or to conventional teaching, and tutoring yielded much better performance. The average tutored student performed at the 98th percentile of students taught with the conventional method. They also say that deliberate practice can include activities that teachers design for in-between meetings, essentially just homework. So really anything that you can get feedback on from a professional or a teacher counts as deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is also different to play because they claim that deliberate practice requires effort and is not inherently enjoyable. It's more that the results are enjoyable in that you enjoy realizing that you are better at something that you're trying to become better at, but not necessarily the process of becoming better. Some more details about deliberate practice. It requires available time and energy for the individual as well as access to teachers, training material, and training facilities. So these are resource constraints. Not everyone can have access to these. So I can already see a problem here with how people tend to use the phrase of 10,000 hours of practice. The original study is only measuring and referring to a certain type of practice that involves essentially being tutored in some way. Whereas if someone just hears that 10,000 hours of practice makes you a master at something, they might think that just playing an instrument for 10,000 hours without any sort of teacher will make them an expert and a master at that instrument. Okay, so they did 2 studies. One was on violinists and one was on pianists. In the first one, they got 10 students that were nominated the best violinists, 10 students that were nominated good violinists, and 10 students from the music education department, so people who were planning to become music teachers. And then they also got 10 middle-aged people who were already considered professionals on the violin. So they only had 40 participants in the study, so I think you can take a guess that we can't really be sure of how reflective this is of the general population of people studying the violin, let alone other skills. Each participant was asked about their history of learning violin, when they started practice, how many music teachers they had, participation in competitions, and how many hours per week they practiced the violin. And then they were asked how much they currently practice, and they got a diary for the coming week and had to take note of everything they did within that week. Now, something that I was interested in with this study was what is the range of different amounts of practice that people had. They talk about the averages everywhere. There's an average of 10,000 hours by the time people are 20. But if there are only 10 participants, then surely they can list the 10 different values they had for the number of hours practiced. But they don't actually include that in the study. They only give you the averages. But I personally think that seeing each individual value of number of hours practiced would change the way you see the study. It might make the number 10,000 seem more legit, or it might make it seem less legit. Because maybe one person practiced 5,000 hours, another person practiced 6,000, and then so on. And all the averages of all those are 10,000. But actually have a range of like 5,000 to 15,000. But I don't know, because they don't include that. The histories of the 4 groups of subject were remarkably similar. On average, they began practicing at 7.9 years old, and they started lessons at 8 years old. They first decided to become musicians at 15. The average number of music teachers they had was 4. The average number of musical instruments they had studied beyond the violin was almost 2. That makes me think about my history of playing piano, because I started playing piano and having lessons when I was 8 years old. And I decided to become a musician at around 17. I've probably had a similar number of piano teachers as well. I've studied way more musical instruments than that though. I did harmonica for a hot minute as well when I was in primary school. Maybe I've planned my life all wrong. Maybe I should have become a professional pianist. Look, I've only missed out on a couple of years of practice recently. Maybe I can still do it. Okay, I'm quitting music production. I'm not going to be a music producer. I'm just going to be a concert pianist now. So, see you in 10,000 hours of practice. So here are some graphs for the amount of time practiced by the different levels of students. And there's not much difference between the best students and the good students, but there's a significant difference between them and the teachers. They also found that sleep was quite important for improving violin performance. They decided the high relevance of sleep must be indirect and related to the need to recover from effortful activities such as practice. The 2 best groups had a weekly amount of sleep at about 60 hours, and the average for music teachers was 54.6. They also found that the best violin students and good violin students both napped more than the music teachers. Apart from saying that you need 10,000 hours of practice, you could also say that you need to nap for like 2 hours a day. So it seems that the best students napped between 2 and 3 or 2 and 4 about 25% of the time. Fascinating. Well, I know what I'm going to start doing to increase my skills. Aha, and now we get to the accumulated amount of practice by specific ages. So they looked at the amount of practice young violinists had accumulated by age 18. The best young violinists had accumulated an average of 7,400 hours of practice. The good violinists had accumulated 5,300 hours, and music teachers had accumulated 3,400 hours. So the study itself didn't even take special note of 10,000 hours by age 20. It's just in this graph that's here. So if Gladwell was reading the study to get 10,000 hours, they would have had to look at this graph and then choose which statistic to go with. There was a second study done here, which was looking at pianists, but there's nothing really too different in this study. So I think what we can gather from reading the study and what other people have said about it as well, is that actually the 10,000 hours wasn't even coming from a point in which people would be considered as absolutely mastering something and being able to win competitions at what they were looking at in the study, which was specifically playing the violin, and in the second half of the study, playing the piano. And they only looked at the skill of musical instruments. So for other skills, the number of hours could be completely different. And also the 10,000 hours was only an average and only at a specific age of 20 years old. So, if you accumulate the 10,000 hours over a longer period of time or over the same period of time, but you start later, will it have the same effect as if you had 10,000 hours by the time you turned 20? Maybe it would have the same effect, maybe it wouldn't have the same effect, because people tend to be able to learn things quicker and more easily when they're younger. When I read this study, the point seems to be more differentiating between deliberate practice and other forms of practice or learning, and just showing that deliberate practice plays a role in getting to an expert level. But it doesn't say that it's the only thing that's required as well. And also, as we saw in the background of the study, deliberate practice is different from just simply practicing at home by yourself. And the more you do it, the better you will be, but it doesn't go into the differences between different people that are on the same level. Kind of seems like a very shaky basis for a 10,000 hour rule. But honestly, it really doesn't seem like the study was trying to say what people now have taken from it in popular culture. And with that said, I am quitting music production and I'm going into being a full-time concert pianist. And stay skeptical, but only after you subscribe, hit the bell, and watch the rest of my other videos.